I think it's time to bring April into the session as well.
Hello.
Hello, April.
Hi.
I don't see your screen yet. Oh yeah, I see you. Hi. Yeah, you're there. How are you?
Doing well. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, we're great. We had a great session. So we're.
I was eavesdropping. It's always good stuff with
Yeah.
Abel speaking.
Yeah, it's really great. So we're looking forward to your session as well. But yeah, let's do a short intro first. So, well, thanks for being here, most of all. And I've been looking at your profile for a little bit, and I've noticed that you've become an ambassador for HashiCorp quite recently. So, anything you can share with us about that?
Sure. So HashiCorp has launched their ambassador program this year, officially in 2020. And a lot of people got either voted in or elected in. It was they started the program very quietly on the back end to kind of mirror the Microsoft MVP program. So who are the most valuable contributors to the HashiCorp environments? So I was elected in for a lot of the work I do with HashiCorp directly, and I contribute to through CSC here at Microsoft, and also all the videos I've done and promotion of the Terraform projects that I work with.
Yeah, I could imagine that it was Terraform related. So yeah, I've noticed that you were a cloud advocate for a while now. Anything you can share with us about your journey there? How did you become a cloud advocate?
So my official title is actually senior software engineer at Microsoft. So I actually work in the engineering side, more or less. So I'm very much build with, code with customers. So I actually started Microsoft about 2.5 years ago. I started as a TSP, so kind of technical pre-sales. And when the role changed, the TSP role changed quite a bit. I was looking for something different, and being in front of customers was paramount. But I get to live and breathe kind of DevOps and the technologies with customers every day. So I'm deploying with customers into Azure, usually net new kind of projects, and then we give a lot of feedback to the product group and engineering. So it's a really cool place to be able to contribute and to build out with customers as well.
Yeah, great. So you will do a session about a deep dive session about Azure DevOps, which I'm looking really forward to, because we are also working with the DevOps currently. Well, me and my team. Cool. And I want to learn some tricks from the master. So I think the floor is yours. Have fun.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Right. Can you guys see everything? All right. Yep. So today we're going to talk about managing delivery of your application using A/B deployments in Azure. And why is this important? Well, when you deploy an application, you need to be able to test it. You just don't want it to deploy it to production and then go, oh, that didn't work, and then backtrack. So we want to talk about different ways we can leverage Azure and some of the tooling in Azure DevOps to do this. So as we start, we're going to kind of give an example of the evolution of people, process, and products, and where that's come from and where it's going. So I have a bit of a video to show you. If you can't hear it, that's absolutely okay. Let's just look at the visual. So that video, while there wasn't any sound coming out, it was really, really painful to watch that first race car. We had a couple people doing some things and it took them quite a bit of time. And the pit stop time was pretty long. Then we look at the next video in 2013 from Melbourne, and they were able to do a pit stop change in a matter of, less than 30 seconds. Now, why is this important? Because this is DevOps. This is exactly why DevOps is important. Let's think about, maybe back, several years ago, maybe you're doing it today, how you're deploying your applications. Used to maybe go into the data center, go into the racks, go to the server and make those changes yourself. And you might be kind of muddling into maybe all the different systems involved, maybe your storage, your networking, and you kind of had your hands doing quite a few things. And when you need to make a change in the application, you did it yourself. Now, when we deploy an application, everyone wants to be involved. We have much larger teams getting involved. We have security teams, we have QA, we have the dev team, we have the ops team. We have so many more people in a much more complex environment deploying our applications out. And when we look at that first video, they're using very manual tools. And why is this related to DevOps? Because we have so many much better tools out there now today. We went from using a manual hammer to using a drill. And what's really key, if we look at the screenshot here of this pit stop change, look at how many people are interacting and how quickly they can get it done and how efficiently. They have people timing the pit stop and looking and reviewing, going, how can we do this better? And that's what we need to be doing in DevOps, looking at how we're doing something today and a better way to achieve that. And then if we look at the back on the left-hand side of this picture here, we see someone with a jack in the back. And then we see someone behind that guy holding another jack. Why? Because that first jack failed and they've experienced that. So they have a backup to the guy with the jack. They have redundancy in place all through and through. So this is a really, really great visual just to understand why DevOps is so important in our organization and how we can leverage it. So what is DevOps? If I were to ask each and every one of you to define DevOps, I'd have a very, very different answer. So DevOps, we know, can do quite a bit for our organizations. And we have a very specific definition of DevOps that we use here at Microsoft. And I take that with all of my customers when we initiate a project. We know that DevOps can accelerate delivery. And we know that we define it as the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And that's how we define DevOps here at Microsoft, delivering that value. Why are we delivering value? Because as we're ops teams and dev teams, we may have different objectives, but we know that we're delivering value to our end users, and we need to keep that at the forefront of our minds. And DevOps is no longer just a theory that we can think about and talk about and read about, but we also have hard statistical facts that show us what high-performing DevOps companies actually are able to achieve. We know that high-performing companies can deploy more frequently, 208 times more frequent deployments. In fact, we know there's faster time to commit to deploy. We know we can recover from incidences over 2,600 times faster. And we know we have a 7 times lower change failure rate from these high-performing companies. And of course, our organizations want to know, how can we increase the revenue? How can we have faster time to market? How can we beat out our competition? How many of you remember Blockbuster? You used to go to a store, get a VHS tape, watch it, bring it home. Netflix broke into the market and really stole the show because you can order things on demand and have when you wanted to, whenever you want to order a movie. And you didn't have to go to a store. You didn't have to wait till something was out of stock. Everything's in stock all the time. Another example is Uber. And here in the UK, we've had a lot of issues with taxi organizations getting really upset how Uber's coming in and taking over the market. Why? Because they're delivering what you as an end user wants. They're delivering that value to you. So of course you're going to consume it. So we see other taxi companies playing catch up to deliver that same kind of service with an application. So you can demand where you're going to go, pay on an app, and deliver all those things that end users are now demanding from the market. So those are a couple examples of high performing DevOps companies. So when we look at DevOps and what we can do, today I really want to focus on our deployment strategy as an organization. How are we deploying? What are we doing to do that? And some tools we can leverage in the cloud to help us achieve and be a better DevOps organization. So we have rolling deployments. You may have used rolling deployments in the past where maybe you're deploying to a certain part of your infrastructure, maybe 25% of that infrastructure, and you roll it out to a certain segment, test it, roll it out to a bit more, and then go on to the next part until you've rolled it out to 100% of your infrastructure. And then you might have a blue-green deployment. You might have 2 identical environments. Your green environment is your current production environment that everything's running from, your application, your website, etc. And then you may deploy those changes to your blue environment, and you run tests on that. And when you're ready to flip over to the blue environment, you may either reroute for your load balancer or make another change in another way. And then your green and your old blue environment now becomes your green environment, and that's your production environment. And then the old green becomes the new blue. So you literally are deploying to two identical environments. Another deployment strategy is a Canary deployment. We see this a lot with Kubernetes and containerization. Maybe you're deploying, it's kind of like setting that canary into the cave, and you're deploying to 25% of your infrastructure. Test that out, and some of your users are using that newly deployed feature, that newly deployed application, and then you can switch it on to maybe 50% of the infrastructure, and then you can flip it on to 100. So you kind of send in a few servers to test how it reacts, and then to roll it out to the rest of that infrastructure. Then we have things like feature flags, and you can turn on feature flags to deploy to certain areas of your organization. Almost think of it as like zones. Maybe your first feature flag is going to your IT organization and your VIPs in the business, and then maybe it goes out to the departments, maybe out to geolocation. And with feature flags, you enable a feature, and you can roll back easily by turning off that feature flag. But it's really important we talk about the people, the process, and the products when we talk about all these things. We need to make changes in our organizations. And the people side is the hardest thing to change in an organization, but the most critical. We need to look at the silo in our organizations. Do we have our dev teams and our ops teams fighting for control over how these applications are deploying? So what we're going to do in a minute is show you how that the ops teams and the dev teams can work together to do this together, so that we're not clashing in our value add to our organization and our end users. And we really need to look at the process. We need to plan our deployments and develop it. And then we need to start testing them early on. We need to think of shift left, test early. Then we need to go into our release cycle and production. And a really important part of that process is monitoring and learning, so we can make changes for the next iteration, because our process will enable us to make changes and do better each and every time. And when we look at the products, there are tons of products for us to use out there in the market. For developers and operational teams, when we want to develop our code, we have great tools like GitHub. We have Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code that help you enable your code, read your code, and make changes, and help you use some inherent intelligence from the get-go to make your code better early on. We can help you deliver your code with using tools like Azure DevOps and GitHub, different extensions built into GitHub. There's so many great features coming out now, and things like GitHub Actions to help you automate. And then operationally, we have things to help you ongoing to kind of see how the environment's working, how your day-to-day is running, and things like Azure Monitor, Azure Policy, and different types of automation and Security Center. And all of these things help you kind of run at scale and deliver with that confidence in your organization to help you give you that full cycle. So delivery, let's talk about Azure DevOps. This is the tool we're going to focus on today. Now, Azure DevOps is a great, fantastic tool. And the thing I want to highlight about Azure DevOps is, even though the title says Azure DevOps, you don't have to deploy to Azure only. Azure DevOps allows you to deploy any language to any platform. And I really mean it, any language to any platform. I work with customers that are deploying into multiple cloud environments, and they have a hybrid cloud strategy. So maybe they're deploying to their on-prem environment. Maybe they're deploying to AWS or GCP and Azure. We see a lot of our customers embracing tools like Azure DevOps that enable them to do this. And they can bring any language they want with them: Java, C#, Go, the list goes on. Bring that language with you. And Azure DevOps is really made up of 5 components. So we're not going to use all the components today, but we are going to use some of them to deliver our application to the cloud. So the first component is going to be Azure Boards. Now, Azure Boards is, your kind of your Kanban board. It's your task board. There's so much you can do with it. You can monitor and manage all your sprints and what you're doing. You can integrate into GitHub. You can integrate into GitHub Actions and automate how your boards appear as well. You can put in swim lanes. It's Scrum and Agile ready to help you run with your sprints, kind of your stand-ups, plan your work, and have full end-to-end lifecycle for not only your developers, but also your project management and even your operational teams to track what tasks are going on. The next piece we're going to talk about is Azure Repos. This is a great element built into Azure DevOps to put your code in. Now, your code will sit into the same kind of organizational unit as your Active Directory environment, and it keeps kind of privatized to you. And it is pretty much like GitHub, but focused for Azure DevOps. So it's centralized to that tool. You can even pull from from GitHub as your repository. But today we're going to use both GitHub and our Azure repos together to deploy our code. Then we have Azure Pipelines, and this is effectively our CI/CD tool. And again, any cloud, and you can test kind of any kind of backend performance you need from Linux, Mac or Windows devices. You can test that all from Azure DevOps. It gives you stage environment releases and deployment approval. So we're going to set up an automated pipeline today from end to end and deploy our application. We're going to put in some gates and some manual tasks so that we can have those eyes on our deployments and know exactly what's going on and ensure that everything is where it needs to be. Then we have Azure Artifacts. That's part of Azure DevOps. And this is great for managing any kind of packages you have, sharing some code, and adding your packages to any pipeline. And it supports things like NPM and Maven as well. Then we have Azure Test Plans. And we always get asked, I want to test my code. I want to test early and often. We have a lot of test plans built into Azure DevOps as a product. It's great. It's great for feature-rich capability. We can track our testing and get full end-to-end lifecycle of our tests and have full tracking of that. So everyone's aware that, we made this acquisition of GitHub. So we're going to integrate GitHub today into our Azure pipelines. We can use Azure repos. There are definitely certain use cases for that. But today I want to use GitHub because all my code is sitting in GitHub because I'm a developer and that's what I'm used to. I don't really want to migrate it across. So I'm going to leave it in GitHub. And if you're not familiar with GitHub, it is a great source code tool. I'll go through it with you in a couple minutes. So again, like I've mentioned, Azure DevOps will integrate directly into GitHub with extensions. And we're going to walk through those in just a second as well and how to set those up and how they authenticate. So I want to give you kind of this scenario, right? I told you we're going to work on this people side of, we have our dev team and our ops team, and we need to work together to deploy and share the load of what we're deploying to the cloud at our company, Tailwind Traders. So if you're working on the dev team, what are you going to contribute to this cycle? Well, I'm going to have my code. I want to run some unit tests. We're going to manage and maintain our GitHub repo, but I also want to help build out that CI/CD automation as well. And then the ops team plays also an equally important role into this. They're going to manage the Azure DevOps project, anything from maybe the project management and keeping track of what tasks are going on, but they're going to manage the web servers and the environment. They need to be aware of the scaling and also the CI/CD automation and how it affects it. They also need to wrap around that monitoring and security to make sure they're delivering that SLA of this Tailwind Traders app. So let's get into the demo. So this is our website, Tailwind Traders. We send a bunch of stuff out, and it's working. We can scroll through it. We can, put in some items into our cart. We can go shopping. But let's look at the top here. We have this element here where it says free shipping for orders of $100 or more. Now, we've been approached by our marketing team, and they say, we want to run a test over the bank holiday weekend. We have a 3-day weekend coming up, and, I'd like to run a test. What if we increase our shipping threshold? What effect is that going to have on our business? Will we lose orders or will we make more in orders because people are trying to reach and obtain that threshold? Now, there's a couple ways we could approach this. Now, let's put our thinking caps on and think, right, we could, deploy a whole new environment out, get that stood up for them. We could deploy this into Azure. Do we want to do, how do we want to do this? Well, our website's already built as a web app, an Azure web app. So it's running as platform as a service. So there's some features we can use in there. So we kind of think about how we can do this and, say the marketing team, of course we can deliver this for you. When do you need to buy? And of course they're going to respond with yesterday. But the reality is they say, actually, we want it for the weekend. It's Thursday. Can we have it by tomorrow? And, in a traditional environment, you're sweating it out going, how do I get this ready for them? How do I do this? But we're a high performing DevOps organization. So this is no sweat for us. So let's change this shipping threshold and deliver this out to the marketing team. So we have our website here. Great. Now our developers have handed us our code. And this is our code that is running our website. Now we don't need to know everything that's going on with it. Now I'm using my favorite IDE, VS Code. I like it. It's simple, but it also is connecting to my GitHub repo. So while my source code is sitting in my GitHub repo, I want to edit it from VS Code. So we want to change that threshold that the marketing people have asked us to do. So I'm just going to go in simply here, change this threshold to $250. On the left-hand side here, we see I have an extension installed, and this is hooked up to my GitHub repo. It sees the change. It's auto-saved it. It sees I've made this change in my file. So I'm going to go ahead and commit those changes. I'm going to go change to shipping and just give it a little comment. I'm going to go ahead and send that across. So I'm going to sync those changes up. So we can see here on the left-hand side, we got a little timer. We can see the bar moving at the top. It's syncing across. And we can see that it's pushing some changes to my repo. So it looks like it's made the changes. And if I go to my repo up here, I can see this is where all my code is. So I'm just going to refresh my screen, and I can say, here we go. 20 seconds ago, we made a change. Someone made a change to that code. Great. I can see that I've made change to my shipping here. Now, I want to get this code from my GitHub repo into my Azure DevOps pipeline. So I can go into this marketplace here, and we, like I told you before, and I promised you, we have a hook in for Azure pipelines. So if I type in Azure pipelines, hit search, I can see Azure pipelines, and I can click on it here. Now I've already pre-configured this for the demo, but you can go and set up a new plan, or you can edit your existing plan. And the way that I'm logged into my GitHub repo here, I'm actually synced in from my VS Code. I've already pre-authenticated. So I need to authenticate from GitHub to Azure DevOps now. Now, if I go down here and hit configure, I'll ask for my GitHub password, hit confirm, log in, and we can see the Azure Pipelines plugin here. Now, I can give access to all my repositories or select ones. Now, I've already given it access to my Tailwind Traders website. Now, when I go to set this up for the first time, I will put in I can go in and, view all my other repositories here, choose one, click on it, and deploy to that. It will actually authenticate through. Now, with my Azure DevOps, I'm using my Active Directory account. So the same login that I use for my laptop is kind of that backbone to authenticate between Azure DevOps, and that's hooked into my GitHub and my VS Code. So I'm using the kind of that integrated authentication platform to pull this through. So if I go into Azure DevOps, I've actually already set this up to automatically run. And I promised you we had these like kind of 5 elements, right? And these are our pipelines. This is our CI/CD pipeline. So I am building my code right now. I've told it to build my code, and I can see it's running that pipeline. I can see the build job. I can see all the tasks, and it'll take a couple minutes to run. It's going to take that code I just made the changes to. It's going to package it up. And what it's going to do, it's going to build it, and we're going to run some tests against it. We're going to copy those files and publish it as a build artifact, so then we can build our next pipeline. And we can release that code and make changes to it. So we can let our code build here. We're good to go. It's going to test it. So hopefully my code passed all the tests that we need it to in order for it to be released into our environment. Now, I want to release this code into our environment. I'm going to go down to the Releases tab here while our code's building, let that build in the background. And I'm going to create a new release pipeline, okay? Now, I already have one set up, so just for warning, in case we lose internet or anything happens, I will revert to that, but we're going to create one net new. So we're building our code out. I want to create a pipeline, and what's really cool about this is, when I go to create a pipeline, there's all these templates that I can pull from here. And that's really great. I can choose where I want to deploy to. If I'm deploying to Kubernetes, or maybe I have a Python app I want to deploy to, or maybe I have an Azure App Service deployment that I'm trying to work to. Now, what I didn't tell you guys is what the environment's going to look like. So if I go into my Azure Portal here, everything that we're deploying for Tailwind Traders is actually in an Azure web app, okay? So I have my production environment here. I've set it up. So we're going to deploy to that. So in our release pipeline, I want to select Azure App Service Deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and it's going to deploy what's called a stage. This is my stage. Now, I actually don't have just one environment. I have 2. I have a staging environment, and I have my production. Okay, so this first stage is actually going to hook into our staging environment because I don't want to deploy everything to production. So if I go to my staging website here, we can see that's the staging environment. I want to make changes to that first because I don't want to deploy that to production and make mistakes. So if I go back to my dashboard, I can see that I have the Tailwind Traders staging environment right here that I can click on, that web app. So I want to call this the staging environment. We hit OK, go over there, and I want to create a task, and I want to create a job so that does something. So this is our staging environment. So all the changes there will be there. So I have to go in and click here and subscribe to my Azure subscription. So I talked about my Active Directory kind of being on the back end. So I've already kind of pre-authenticated, so I'm going to add that internal subscription. It's going to go to Azure and say, yes, you can authenticate through. Now, again, we can deploy this to on-prem and have that access through. Now I can choose what kind of web app I'm deploying to. So I've told it it's going to deploy to a web app. I have options here. I can deploy this to a web app on Linux or Windows or containers, or maybe I'm deploying to a function app. But for this case, we're just going to use a web app on Windows, and I get to choose my app service name. So because it's authenticated through, I can see all the web apps in the subscription I have access to. So we're going to deploy to our staging environment. So I want to deploy to the staging stage, if you will, the staging web app. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to hit save. And I can add comments there if I want to. Absolutely. So I've created that. So that's our staging stage, if you will. And then I go to the deploy the app service, and it's inheriting some of those things I just put in. So where I've put in, the connection to the Azure subscription, what time of app service it is, it's all included in here. And I can add all sorts of other kind of output variables and other items from here as well. So it knows exactly what app service it's going to. Everything's happy. Yeah, I'm okay with that. So I go back to my pipeline here. We have a staging environment. And what I want to do is, I can add another environment. Maybe I want to add a task to go maybe running in parallel. I can add a task that will run in parallel to the staging environment, or maybe I want to run one after. So once it runs through the staging environment, I want it to deploy to, production maybe, or maybe not. We're actually in production. We do have this production environment, but I want to take advantage of some of the great features in Azure. So instead of deploying straight to production, we're going to create a Canary environment. So we're going to have 3 environments, basically. We're going to have our staging environment that we'll deploy everything to. And then once we test it and know it's working, we're then going to deploy to our Canary environment. And what's really cool is instead of having to deploy a bunch of servers, I'm going to use my Azure web app. And we have something called deployment slots. So I'm in my production environment. I go down to deployment slots. Now I've already pre-created this, our Canary environment, but we can even add a slot on the fly. So if we want to add a slot, this can be an identical environment to production. So that age-old issue of, well, it worked in my environment, it doesn't work in production, we can resolve, right? So I can just call this my test environment. And you can see here that it will give it, the Tailwind Traders website, production-test. And I have this option here to either clone my settings from my production environment, and then I have an identical replica from production. I am testing like for like using a staging slot. Now, this staging slot is built in as a feature. It's included in the cost. I don't pay any extra for it. It's just an enablement tool built into the platform. So I can clone that, or maybe I want to do something completely different and not clone the settings, but we want like for like. So here I would just hit, clone from there, and I hit add, and we create that staging slot for us. So I'm not going to do that just yet, but I do want to test this in our Canary environment. And if we look at the staging slot here, everything's running to production. Everything on our production website is going to hit that load balancer and go there. But actually, what I want to do is hit 50% of our traffic to that in Canary environment and 50% to production. And I'll show you why in a minute. So I've made those changes. We go into our release pipeline. So instead of it going to production, we're going to make this Canary. And again, we need to configure the jobs and the tasks. Now, I will choose my Azure subscription that's pre-authenticated through. We're going to stay on that same web app, but I need to choose the app service that we're going to deploy to. Now, remember, this is still the same app service environment. So that is our production environment. We're going to save that. We can make some comments in there. And then the action to actually run our web app, we need to make one differentiator here. Yes, we have the app service name production, but we need to deploy to a slot or maybe a different app service environment. So as I hit this drop down here, it sees the resource group where I built this, and it sees my slots. So remember, I have that Canary slot and I have that production slot. I want to deploy this to Canary first. So this is enabling us to do more testing and actually get real end user experience. So what I've done is, if we go back to our pipeline here, everything will deploy to the staging environment. Then we'll deploy to Canary. Now I think we're ready to go to production. So I can hit this clone button because all those settings are where I need to go. I actually want to call this production and not copy of Canary. And I need to go into my jobs and my tasks. So if you're paying attention very closely, we configured that staging slot, right? We don't want it to go to Canary, we want it to match production for production. So let me refresh the slot, and I should be able to pick up production from here. And it should pull that up. And it's not, but that's okay. So we're going to DevOps this a little bit. I want to take this slot, and actually, I want to delete production stage. It didn't come out as I wanted to. That's okay. That's the beauty of the cloud. We can get rid of it. So I'm going to add another slot. Again, I'm going to do the same thing again. It didn't clone properly. I don't know why. That's okay. We'll DevOps that. So let's get production up and running. Let's go into our tasks. Oh, I need some of my production settings. So we need to go and reconfigure everything again. It's good to know we have that clone option there. I'm not sure why it didn't work, but that's okay. We didn't affect anything that we needed to. So we're in our production slot. We save that and go into our app service. So again, we're going to deploy to this slot, same as we did before in our Canary environment. And yes, we want to go to our staging slot. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm really happy with this pipeline. It looks pretty good to me. So let's look at our pipeline here. We have our 3 environments. So each of these stages reflects that environment in our app service that we can deploy to. So before we go any further, I want to go look at how our build's going in our pipeline. So I've made my saves here, go into my pipeline, and I should see, yep, our build has been configured, and I can see that it's been successful. This is great. Now we have a couple warnings here, nothing that's really going to affect what I'm deploying to today, but I can go through the build job and say, right, we've packaged our code, I've ran my tests against it, I know my code is ready to go, and I can put that into our release pipeline. So I go back into our releases, our build's successful, that's great news. And I need to go into the environment into the release that we just built. And I didn't give it a name, so I need to do that. So I'm going to call it, shipping change pipeline. So I know which one it is, because I might have multiple pipelines in my organization. So I'm going to save that, and we know what the changes are. So this is great. We know our build is good to go. And like I said, it's going to package it as an artifact. So I need to add that artifact into the pipeline. So where's our source? This build that we just created. Now we can change, what the default version is going to be. So I want to go my latest build because I want to know every time I submit code, I want that latest to go into our artifact and go through all the testing. Now I can use a specific branch. I can use branching policies to say, you know what, we have to, deploy it to a branch, maybe use specific tags and not allow things to come from maybe that main branch that we've deployed to, or we could use specific versions or maybe specifying at the time of that creation. But I want to go my latest build. And I'm going to hit add. So that artifact's going to go in. Now, I could manually trigger this every time, but actually I want to automate this. So every time a build's successful, it's going to deploy. Now, before I do that, the way our pipeline looks today, we will complete with staging. All the checks will go through. It will then deploy to Canary and then deploy to production. Well, that's great and automated. There's some other features we really need to take advantage of in Azure DevOps. We have post-deployment conditions, and these are fantastic for putting in some manual checks, but also helping putting in policies. So I'm going to require a post-deployment approval. Now, this could be a group of users or, whomever, or a group of people. Now, I'm going to make it myself. Now, traditionally, I would make it someone who didn't write the code and deploy it. Maybe it's my ops team. Maybe it's my security team. And when it completes the staging deployment, I need to check it, maybe give it a manual view and have that approval feedback mechanism. The other thing we can do is we can add gates to it. So maybe we add a delay or some other kind of metric. We can invoke an Azure function or maybe check for Azure policy compliance. And we see so many customers that have to check Azure policy so that we're not just deploying things into our environments without any kind of checks and balances. And maybe we want to query Azure Monitor. So maybe we know it's running in staging, but how well is this app really performing? So being able to query Azure Monitor is really important. Or maybe query the work items and make sure we're ticking all those boxes and following through on the PM side of it. So those gates are really good. And we can also do an auto deploy trigger, a redeploy trigger. So maybe this deployment fails, we're just going to automatically redeploy it. And maybe that's really critical because maybe it failed for some reason, or maybe our service wasn't available, or there was some kind of issue. So we can tell it, deploy on failure or redeploy to the last successful deployment. But for now, I'm just going to put a post-deployment approval on so that I have to approve it every time. Now, the other thing you can put on is a pre-deployment condition. So our checks and balances can go through Canary and, go through staging. And then we deploy, give that manual approval to Canary and say, right, well, after Canary, I don't want it to go to production just yet. I want some more checks in place. So that's exactly what we can do here. After it goes through Canary, after the stage of Canary, and we can select the stage here, I want another check-in. Again, we can do some artifact filters. We can do a pull request deployment. We can do a schedule, and we can do pre-deployment approvals and gates. So very similar to the post-deployment, we have very similar settings. So I'm going to go ahead and add myself in as an approver and add that manual check. So I've put that artifact in there from our builds, but it wasn't automatic. Okay, so in the future, whenever we make changes, I want to make this automatic. Every time a build succeeds, I want to put in a trigger. So right now it's disabled. So I can even add in a pull request trigger. But actually, I'm going to do a continuous deployment, and I can add filters, any kind of branch filter, or so that I'm not always deploying to that main branch. But for now, we're going to deploy to the main branch. So I'm going to save this, and we're going to create a release. So all we're going to do now is manually deploy it for the first time, but every time thereof, we can set we can set a trigger change for every time we have, if we need to put in some manual bits, it'll show us the artifact we're pulling in, and we hit create. So we can see that a release has been created. And while this release is being created, I can click on it and I can really watch it. I can see it's being queued. It's pulling in the build agent. But you know what? Ideally, it's a good time to go get a cup of coffee and come back to it while it's building. But while this is actually building, I just want to kind of show off something that, is recognizable to everyone in the industry. So we're going through a live demo, and these tools are fantastic, but maybe you've made some investments in your environment that you want to maintain going forward. That's okay. And we want you to do that. So it's really important where, maybe, we talk about this whole process of DevOps where you're planning and tracking your work, you're doing development and testing, and you're going to release and monitoring learning. And there's so many tools out there that will help you with all of these. Now, the reason why I really, really like Azure DevOps, and we use it with so many of our customers, is because it does all of these things that these other tools do. So you can absolutely integrate the tools you've already invested in into Azure DevOps, but you can also use Azure DevOps to do a lot of the things you do before. So maybe you're looking for some monitoring. So we kind of saw Azure monitoring plugin, but maybe you want to get some feedback from Splunk or Nagios, or you're doing some kind of planning tools in Jira and you want to integrate that into Azure DevOps. And then things like integrating Jenkins and GitLab and GitHub into Azure DevOps is absolutely possible. So remember, keep your investments when you move to the cloud. So I want to go back and see how my release is going. So we can see that it's deploying to my Azure app service here. We can see it, we can watch it, we can view the logs on it. We can see that it's deploying. We can watch everything go on. Again, great time to get a cup of coffee, but we're going to run this live and see how it goes. So all in all, this build and deploy, usually takes about a minute or two. So hopefully this will go very soon. But all it's doing is taking the code that we've packaged and making those changes to that environment. So when we talk about running this on any cloud, this is really important because not everyone's using an Azure Web App. Now, there's great features and benefits built into these Azure Web Apps, but ideally, not everyone has access to it. So let's go back to our pipeline. We can see that our deployment here has finished, right? So I talked about this post-deployment approval. It's waiting my approval. It's waiting on me specifically. And I'm like, well, okay, what do I need to do first? I want to go to my website. So this is our staging website that I promised you. It said $100 or more for our orders. So we want to test these changes before we go any further with it. So I'm going to refresh this and it's going to show me the changes I made. And here we have $250 change in shipping. So I'm just going to go quickly approve this. Yes, all good, and we approve it and the changes go forward and I have full logging on that. So what it's going to do is I've given a visual inspection of my website. It's then going to deploy to the Canary environment. So if I go to my website here, we can see that we've made the changes. We can run some performance metrics and go, right, everything's happening as it should. There's no other bugs in the website. It was one small change. We're good to go. So we deployed to Canary. So the whole idea is when we deploy to Canary, we're using this Azure web app here, and we're going to run half our traffic using the built-in load balancing capability of Azure Web Apps to run 50% of production of our traffic to production and 50% to Canary. Now, why is this important? because our marketing department and our organization wants to know what the effect of that shipping threshold change has on our organization. So we can give back hard metrics. We can see how many visitors went to each site, how much they bought, and that makes the marketing team happy and the organization happy, because as a company at Tailwind Traders, we know what the changes were. So we're basically just going to split this traffic, use A/B testing to achieve this. And looking at our pipeline, we can see that our Canary environment is still deploying. So we're able to take different technologies here and bring them together in the cloud. And you can absolutely set up these environments on premise or using virtual machines or other technologies, or even using things like containerization. That's absolutely viable. And we're using these tools to help us, make some changes in our organization so that we are a high performing DevOps organization, and that we can use these tools. But then we can use things like Azure DevOps to also help with the process. We can use Azure boards and dig into all of our tasks. So we can see here that in our Canary environment, it is deploying. So we're going to give it another minute. The other one ran fairly quickly. If we have a look at how long that took, total deployment time was 1 minute and 14 seconds. So I expect Canary to go through very shortly now. So if I click on the Canary tasks here, it's running for about 1.5 minutes. It's taking a little bit longer. That's okay. Give it another second and it will deploy. But again, I can see all these changes and I can view the logs as it's progressing. And these are great logs. So when your organization wants to know what changes you're making and when they were made, how they were made, we have these logs. We can feed that back into the organization. And that's really great, because a lot of times we make changes and we don't have that tracking mechanism. That helps us track that. So great. It looks like Canary's done. Go back to our pipeline. Let's look at where we are with it. Everything's green. That's always good. So I'm going to actually go to my Canary website. Now, it did show $100. It does have the Canary label here. Again, we can give this a custom DNS name to make it a little bit prettier in the future as well. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh my website. Great. Canary's showing $250. So a little bit of an exercise for you at home. Get out your mobile phone or your device and go to this QR code. And you should see 50% of you should see the changes on the $250 change. The other 50% should be $100. Now, I'm going to leave this running for the next little while. So always feel free to give me feedback if you think you saw it, or maybe hit it on different devices and see if you get different results. But that's what the end user should absolutely experience when they're using this mechanism. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. There's some great resources on DevOps. We have Channel 9, we have Microsoft Learn, we have Azure DevOps Labs, and Microsoft Documentation, which will walk you through this. And if you want to get started on Azure DevOps, we have Azure DevOps Labs, hands-on labs that get started and start working through a lot of these as well. So I want to thank you for tuning in. It was great to teach you about A/B testing in Azure using Azure Web Apps and Azure DevOps.